Hi, my name is Mike Feldman, and I'm with my good friend and college law school classmate, Mitch Wagner, and we're here to talk about a new book he's written called Caught in the Campus Crossfire. And it's about the Middle East conflict and about the pro-Palestinian protests on U.S. college campuses. So first, Mitch, tell us briefly about yourself.
First of all, thanks for doing this. I appreciate it, Michael. Pertinent to this book, I was raised Jewish in a Reformed synagogue and I was bar mitzvahed. But after that, I really wasn't very observant once I left the household. But I've always identified as definitely Jewish and been proud as a Jew, but wasn't particularly involved. And later, I became more involved with Jewish matters. And in the last 15 years or so, I've been involved in a number of pro-Israel and pro-Jewish organizations, including lobbying in Washington, D.C. And I've been to Israel twice. As is also pertinent to the book because it's got to do with the legal aspects of the protests and the harassment of Jews on college campuses. I practiced law for 35 years as a civil trial lawyer.
And I know that because I know how dedicated of a lawyer you are, Mitch, and how passionate about this book you are. So what I'd like you to do is, why don't you tell us about why you wrote the novel?
It didn't start out as a novel. It started out after October 7 with the angst that so many of us felt in dealing with it and dealing with what was happening on our U.S. college campuses with the protests and the harassment of Jews and frustration over the lack of institutional response to the harassment of Jews and the failure of organizations that I would have thought would have stood up and helped students, and from my perspective, really didn't. And so I was just writing to express the frustrations and then started doing the legal research myself and started to develop a storyline. And I thought maybe there's something here to it. Maybe this would be a good means of, through a vehicle that entertains, educating people, including Jewish students and their parents and families, about the legal recourse they have and the tools available to them to fight campus anti-Semitism. So once I got done writing it, I had several friends and family members, you of course included, read it and share with me your thoughts, and I was encouraged to go ahead with it and see about getting it published. So that's what we did.
So without giving the whole story away, why don't you tell us a little bit about what the novel's about?
So it's about the campus protests across the country.
And when you say campus protests, what do you mean by that?
Good point. I'm talking about the encampments and the protests by Palestinian supporters and how those have escalated into harassment of Jews with threats of violence and in some instances actual violence toward Jews, and the failure of many of the schools to respond and the utter fear experienced by a lot of Jews on campus. And the potential with these kinds of situations is to escalate and turn into actual violence on a broader scale and sometimes catastrophic violence. The logical final step is somebody getting killed. And I thought, how better to illustrate the danger than to have a campus shooting during one of these protests. And so that's what happens in the story. A student is shot, and the book is then about the recourse on behalf of the family through criminal prosecutions of those involved and a civil lawsuit against, among others, the university for allowing the protests to continue unabated despite the escalating harassment and threats against Jews. And that's the storyline without giving it all away.
So you weave in this story a lot of your legal background, I take it, correct?
Oh, absolutely. It's really important to understand the law, especially because of how it's been reported broadly in social media and on the mainstream media. The focus has been largely on Palestinian First Amendment protest rights. And in fact, that's been the clarion call at many of these campuses where it's gotten out of control, notably at Harvard, MIT, and Columbia, which were the focus of the congressional hearings last year, where the presidents of those universities were called to testify. And so they always focus on First Amendment rights and not encroaching on the rights of pro-Palestinians to protest. And that's only part of the story. The other part is, there's two parts to it, and the book goes into legally. The one part is that the First Amendment does not protect all speech, and it does not protect what is considered conduct. So for example, conduct such as what's happened at some of those universities with vandalism, breaking into buildings, that's just simple criminal trespass and vandalism. That's not protected by the First Amendment.
Right.
And even what is considered speech is not always protected. So if it is, a prime example a lot of people hear about is you cannot yell fire in a crowded movie theater. Well, neither can you threaten violence and intimidate students. So that is an aspect that the book goes into, including federal case laws, including Supreme Court cases, talking about, as an example, you can't burn crosses in front of Black Americans to intimidate and threaten and harass them. And by logical extension, neither should you be able to call for the slaughter of Jews on campus in front of Jews to threaten, harass, and intimidate them. And the final part of the aspect of this that the book goes into is there are civil rights laws that protect students on campuses that receive federal tax funding and protect them from harassment, discrimination, and threats of violence, and what is considered in the case law, what is referred to as an abusive environment. So the book goes into all of this in some detail.
So why don't you explain to me, how does it all come about in your book?
Well, in the book, the student is killed during the protests, and it happens after the tensions and the protests escalate as part of curricula under which the Middle East studies are taught by a pro-Palestinian professor who happens to be the head of the department. And he has a distinctly one-sided view of the Middle East. He teaches a decidedly one-sided view. He prohibits dissenting voices.
When you say a one-sided view, what sided view is it?
On behalf of the Palestinians. And so Israel is vilified, the Palestinians are victims, Israel doesn't have a right to exist, all of that. And they're oppressors, they're occupiers, all of the mantra that we hear on the college campuses. But he doesn't allow opposition voices, other viewpoints, which under the law is considered viewpoint discrimination. And more importantly, as the head of the department, he will not permit other professors to teach the subject from a point of view that differs from his own. So it's very one-sided, and that is the message that is conveyed and facilitates or foments additional protests and the ultimate violence. So the lawsuit against the school, against the university, has to do with enforcement based on the Civil Rights Act, and it's the Civil Rights Act of 1964, specifically this title called Title VI. And so the book goes into that whole thing, developing the story with the pursuit of justice.
And how do you deal with these legal issues in the book. I've had the opportunity to read the book, and I know there's a trial. What role does that trial play in dealing with these legal issues?
That's exactly the point. It culminates with the prosecution of the legal case on behalf of the family of the deceased student. And the theory of the lawsuit is you have allowed this situation to occur in violation of the Civil Rights Act and other laws. And so in the course of the legal proceedings, and in particular the trial, and it's a jury trial, so a jury hears the whole case, the law is explained to them and the facts are set forth for them to decide whether what happened at the school was a product of what the school had allowed in violation of the Civil Rights Act and in violation of the other legal protections that should be afforded all students, not just Jewish students, but all students.
So I know that one of your concerns was, how do you deal with these legal issues and make it interesting to the average person who may be overwhelmed by the legalese?
That was a huge concern. And what ultimately I made the decision on, it was basically three things. First of all, again, the point of the book was not just entertainment. It was, there's a term I heard coined. It's not my own.
I like this term, by the way.
Edutainment. Yeah, we've discussed it. Edutainment. Education through entertainment. And that was the idea. It wasn't just to write a story that would be hopefully gripping, but to write a story in a way where the information would be very helpful to students and to families of students so that they would have some knowledge on how to fight anti-Semitism and any form of racism on campus. And if I wasn't going to be able to do that, then to me, there was no sense going ahead with the book.
So can you give us an example of, in the book, which is a great read, I enjoyed it very much, of how you were able to incorporate these legal concepts in the story itself?
I will. Let me complete the thought on this point, though, because the other things that informed my decision were I was concerned about the legalese. And then I thought about a show that I have very much enjoyed over the years. My understanding is Law and Order on television is the longest running television series in history, spanning, I think, over 20 years of episodes over the course of 30 years, because apparently there were breaks in the show.
Hey, Mitch, we're here to pitch your book, but go ahead if you like.
I understand, but the point is this. That show is very good, it's very entertaining, and part of the reason it's very good is unlike just about any other show on TV having to do with the law, they strive for absolute accuracy. And the courtroom proceedings are depicted very accurately on the show. They will discuss actual cases. A number of times they'll mention cases in the show, and I know the cases.
Right.
There was one in particular I remembered from law school. And I thought, that is a clear indication that there is an audience for a show that does go into the law. And finally, I thought, I want to hear from my friends and family. So those of you who I had read it, I asked you, what do you think about it? And I specifically asked, is it too legal? And the response I got was, no, it's very good, it's helpful. There are some places where you get too technical. And so those places where it got a little too technical in the minds of some, I either took those parts out or I simplified it. And then to answer your question about how some of these things play out in the book, I mentioned that under federal law, under Supreme Court law, you can't go burning crosses in front of Black Americans to harass, intimidate them. That's not protected by the First Amendment. And so neither should you be able to harass Jews with chants of calling for their deaths or annihilation. And one of the things that I thought about, because we live in this society now with DEI, which is discussed in the book, diversity, equity, and inclusion, is we have all these protections for people from different backgrounds, including when it comes to gender protection, assuring that people have a right to be called by or referred to by the pronoun that they prefer. And as I was writing the book, there was a case that came down in California where somebody who worked at an assisted living facility was terminated. And he was terminated because he refused to use the preferred pronoun of one of the residents, one of the patient residents.
What do you mean by that?
The resident wanted to go by it or them or whatever it was, and to this individual, it was a female or a male, whichever it was, and he insisted on using him or her, whatever. And he got terminated for this. And how do you justify having that kind of protection for somebody to be called by their preferred pronoun, but not have protection for Jewish and other students who are threatened with death and annihilation? How can you reconcile that? Well, the short answer, of course, Michael, is you can't.
Right.
And so that point is driven home as part of the trial with which the story culminates.
And do you have any other examples of how the rights to be protected from harassment is illustrated in caught in the Campus Crossfire?
There are a number of situations that arise that the book goes into where there's just generally discussion to prompt people to think of common sense things and ways to evaluate the evidence and what the school did.
And you point this out in the book.
Throughout, it's the proceedings, the legal proceedings leading up to the trial. It's the jury selection with the kinds of questions that are asked of the jury, and of course in the trial itself with the evidence that's presented and the witnesses, the experts.
So I've read the book, and you have this weaving of the history of Jews and Arabs in the Middle East, and their conflict, and in this story about how the current day campus protests occur. Can you give us a greater detail about how you do that?
Yes. As we talked about before, the storyline is that a decidedly one-sided presentation is made in the school curricula concerning the Middle East studies.
Right.
And it is just a Palestinian viewpoint, not anything having to do with Israel's perspective. And so that runs afoul of what I alluded to earlier about prohibitions against, so it's called viewpoint discrimination. So to make the point, to get it across to the jury and explain it, the lawyers for the family of the young student who's killed, they call an expert witness who is a Middle East studies instructor, a professor from another school. And he comes and he testifies and he lays out with 2 columns the difference between how it's taught generally and how it's taught by this pro-Palestinian protester, easy for me to say, at the fictional school. And so he has the 2 columns. The one column sets forth, based on him having reviewed the curriculum by the professor, how he teaches it at the fictional university, and then how he teaches it and other teachers teach it to have a more nuanced and fuller balance to the story. And so he, in the trial, testifies, and his 2 columns are shown as an exhibit. And he just explains, this is what this professor is teaching, and these are all the facts that are omitted, and this is the propaganda, and here's the rest of the story.
And is the rest of the story factually correct?
Oh, absolutely.
Can you elaborate on that more?
Yeah, that's a good point. I mentioned before that I've been very involved in pro-Jewish and pro-Israel organizations for the last 15 years. And it's in the last 15 years that I went to Israel. I actually went twice. And as part of that, I started doing a lot of reading, and some fictional, but mostly non-fictional, including by college professors and very intellectual, very knowledgeable people. And as a result, I had a pretty good working understanding of a long history of Israel, going back to the original homeland of the Jews with the first temple in Jerusalem, and the conflict and the various battles between the indigenous Jews and the indigenous Arabs. So a lot of it was a matter of just bringing all that together and going back and doing research to verify the accuracy of the information that I understood and to supplement it and add to it.
And then I know you also do a comparison of the violence against Jews to the violence against blacks.
Absolutely.
Can you expound on how the book addresses that issue?
That is a real issue because you're trying to relate this in a way that people across the board can understand. And this country, of course, has a long history, starting with slavery, of racism towards Black America. And there's not a person who really doesn't know about it. But few people understand anti-Semitism in the same way. So that is discussed at length, as well as going back to the historic relationship in America between Jews and Blacks and the alliance that they had.
And do you address that in the book?
Absolutely. The way it comes up is this, initially. After the case, the lawsuit is filed on behalf of the family of the young man who was shot. The case is assigned to a judge, a Black woman in her 40s.
Oh, the judge is a Black woman in her 40s who's going to be the judge at the trial of this case.
Not only, Michael, of trial, but as you know, in California, when a lawsuit is filed, it is assigned right at the beginning to a judge for all purposes. So all the pretrial activities, including motions and deciding what discovery and information should be exchanged, all that is handled by the judge. So the judge has tremendous influence over how the case is conducted long before it gets to trial. So the concern exists among the lawyers representing the family, how this judge is going to react towards Jews in Israel. Because historically, there is a long alliance between Blacks and Jews in the United States, but that relationship has become fraught in recent years. And the question arises, is this judge going to be more aligned with the generation of years past who related to Jews, or younger generations now who sympathize with Palestinians and tend to be anti-Israel and oftentimes just downright anti-Semitic?
And what do you do in the book? The book's great, and you do a really good job at this. But how does the reader learn about this historic relationship between Black and Jews and the present relationship?
What happens is when the case is assigned to the Black judge, the lawyers for the family are very concerned. And the senior lawyer in particular, because, should I say older? He's my age. He's very concerned because he knows the history. And so they have a discussion in the office and they go into it. And he talks about it. The relationship goes back not just to the civil rights movement, but long before. Very few people know this. Very few people know this. The NAACP was founded by Blacks and Jews together. And it's discussed in the book, and there is actually a clip, Van Jones, the commentator for CNN.
Right, I think I saw him on Bill Maher.
He was on Bill Maher. He's been on Bill Maher many times. But there's a segment last year where he's on Bill Maher's show, Real Time, and he discusses this, and he talks about the NAACP. And so we actually put the video on website for the book.
What's the website?
The website is campuscrossfire.com. And it's a great resource that we can get into in a bit. But that's on there, as is a video from the congressional hearings that we discussed earlier concerning the campus anti-Semitism at Columbia and MIT, and I'm blanking out, but the other school, the three schools, Penn. During the questioning, one of the congressmen, a gentleman named Burgess Owens, grills the presidents about
the presidents of the universities?
The presidents of the universities, thank you, about the practical distinction between allowing abuse of Jews on campus versus blacks. And he makes the point there is no distinction. And if you wouldn't allow this kind of conduct towards black students, you shouldn't be allowing it towards Jewish students. And so we have that on the website also. And so the book goes into all this background, and getting back to your question, that's how it arises, is at the beginning with the black judge, because they're concerned what she's going to think, what her basic attitudes are going to be.
So how is it that much of the young black community today sides with the Palestinians and not with the historic alliance between the blacks and the Jews that helped Martin Luther King lead the black community in the civil rights movement?
There's been a big change. Most young people are probably not aware of that history. And the book goes into that. There's an expert witness on the other side for the university who is totally unaware of that. And so the history briefly is, as you allude to, support for Dr. Martin Luther King. His advisors and speechwriters included Jews. One of his prominent supporters was a rabbi, Rabbi Heschel. Jews marched with Dr. King and his followers in Selma and throughout the South. Jews were involved in the effort to register black voters in the South, and in Mississippi in particular, where two of those young Jewish men, famously Schwerner and Goodman, were murdered and disposed of in a lake, only to be found later. It's the subject of a very good movie with Gene Hackman called Mississippi Burning. But many young generations of black students are unaware of that history, and what they've been taught is different. And so it really started in the 1970s with the World Women's Movement, which every year has a national conference, and I don't recall the specific year, it was the mid-70s, but they had their international conference in Mexico City. And out of nowhere, they put on the agenda a resolution to declare that Zionism is racism. And it passed. And they were so emboldened, and people around the world were so emboldened, who were opposed to Jews in Israel, that they decided to give that same resolution a go later in the year before the United Nations, and it was passed. And at the time, they also came up with this idea of indoctrinating Black Americans to relate to Palestinians as being people of color like they are, and victims of oppression and abuse. And so that's when it started. And then the second component is this. In the last 20, 25 years or so, there's been this movement towards DEI and, you know, the term woke and all, where...
What do you mean by DEI?
Diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so it's to protect people who have, to this point, felt marginalized and mistreated. And the movement has been made to include all people against the oppressors. so there has been this movement to create this world of binary thinking. By binary, I mean you are pigeonholed into one of two categories. And on this particular subject, and the issue of racism and gender discrimination and all these things, you are either oppressor or oppressed, victimizer or victimized, occupier or occupied. And the teaching goes that Israel is white Europeans who are oppressing Palestinians who are people of color and occupying their land and victimizing them. That's the mantra. And you can't fit, there's no nuance. And so, for example, they have a great deal of difficulty dealing with nuance or gray. And so the issues come up with, what about Asians? Because incredibly, Asian Americans do not seem to get very much protection from racism and oppression themselves. And so they are this new term. I shouldn't say new term. I don't know how old it is. It's new to me. I learned this recently. There's a term called white adjacent. And what it means in a nutshell is you may not be technically white, but you enjoy the privileges of being white, and therefore you're not to be protected. So I checked it out in something called the Urban Dictionary. Mm-hmm. And the Urban Dictionary actually gives us an example, an Asian American. It says if you are Asian American, you are white adjacent, and you cannot be the victim of racism because you enjoy privilege.
So this is taught at the universities?
It's before that. It's even before that.
And not only, from what I'm hearing you saying, it's not only that this oppressor-oppress concept is taught at the universities. What isn't taught is equally as important, and that is the history of the alliance between Jews and blacks historically. And I love the term edutainment.
Yes.
Because I've read your book and it's incredibly entertaining. It grabs your attention, but you learn so much about the truth of what's going on in the college campuses and what's going on in the world. And then you bring up this idea of you're white or you're close to white, and therefore you can't be, you can only be an oppressor, correct?
Right.
So how does this idea of Israel being a white colonized state, how much truth is that?
Well, of course, it's absolutely false. It shocks most people, including many Jews, to know that Israel is not white.
And what do you mean by that? I mean,
Israel, forget the Arabs. First of all, 20% of the population of Israel is Arab. And by Arab, I do not mean, there are Arab Jews.
Right. My wife happens to be
from Iraq. Her family is originally from Iraq.
That's correct.
Which we'll touch on later. But aside from the Arab Muslims, which are about 20% of the population, you have the Jewish population of Israel that is the other 80%. And as I said, Jews in Israel, they're portrayed as white European. The fact of the matter is that half of the Jews in Israel are what we would call here people of color. They are Arab Jews, such as Bathsheba, your wife. They are African Jews, notably from Ethiopia. And that just gets whitewashed. And it's not true. And so the whole notion also that the Jews are occupiers, it's just, of course, patently false. They are the indigenous people. Jews were in Israel, what they would call, the Palestinians call Palestine. Jews were there before the Muslim religion existed. Al-Aqsa Mosque, and let me digress a moment on Al-Aqsa Mosque before I get to my point.
This is the mosque that is in Jerusalem in the Old City?
Correct. And the innuendo, the inference, or implication, is that is the most cherished and holiest of Muslim sites. It absolutely is not. Ask any any Muslim, when you pray, what direction do you face? You face toward Mecca. That's the holiest site, not Al-Aqsa Mosque. And so this notion of Israel being interlopers who conquered and took the land is absolutely true and absolutely false. And the true point, which you can get at by asking a question, where is Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem? Where's it built? What's it built on top of? It's built on top of what was the site of the original first temple of the Israelites, which was then destroyed in subsequent conquest. The Jews then built the second temple, and it was after that, when it was destroyed, that Al-Aqsa Mosque was built. So the book goes into a lot of this, but in a vehicle that, as you say, is through entertainment, through what I hope is a compelling story.
Yeah, the way I see it is the book, it's not like you're listening to a professor talk about all these things. It's a story, and you are gripped by the story of what happens to this family, really, and how they seek some type of compensation and accountability through the court system. And you weave that all in so incredibly well, Mitch. I really thank you for that.
I appreciate it. Thank you for your comments.
In fact, it occurred to me as you were telling me about Al-Aqsa Mosque, that Jerusalem isn't mentioned even one time in the Muslim holiest book, the Quran. Did you know that?
You just educated me. I did not know that.
Well, that's the case. Now, we've touched on a number of issues, but what about the LGBTQ community in support of the Palestinians that are, and there's a large segment that's anti-Israel. Does the book address that at all?
Yes. It is, how do I put it? It's a source of, it's perplexing. Let me put it that way. If you are gay or lesbian and you go to Gaza.
Well, before you do that, if you go to Israel, it's my understanding that Tel Aviv is probably one of the most gay-friendly cities in the entire world.
They have parades every year. Yeah.
So they're welcomed and they participate in the parades. But if these same people you're about to say go to Gaza, what do they look forward to?
They better be able to fly.
And why is that?
Because unless they are going to keep their sexuality to themselves, if they're open or they're discovered, they will be thrown off a rooftop. And that's not figurative speech. That's very literal. They will be killed because they do not accept that at all. And incredibly, that community has supported Palestinians across campus, where they have different groups, Pride for Palestine, or different names like that, and they march with their rainbow flags with their names, supporting Palestine, which is just absolutely incredible.
Wow. So let me, you obviously have, many years of experience as a trial lawyer, a successful trial lawyer, and I can see the expertise at which you weave that knowledge in the book. But what was the more difficult part to address in the book in terms of your besides being a lawyer?
The part with the legal proceedings, and in particular, the trial, was easy. Because that's what I've lived for 35 years.
Right.
That's how lawyers talk. It's how they think. It's how they organize and structure the presentation before a jury. The characters are modeled after people I know. That wasn't overly difficult. The history was not overly difficult. The biggest challenge was the character development and the dialogue among the characters that is not part of the legal proceedings, because that's not something I have experience doing. I'm not a novelist. I don't have experience with this.
So why don't you tell us about that character development? Which characters are you talking about?
Well, there are certain characters that are just modeled after particular people. And there's part of the culture that I understand because of people. So earlier we were talking about Batsheva, your wife, being an Israeli Jew of Iraqi descent.
Right.
And Batsheva is, she's warm, sweet, and wonderful, and she's a wonderful cook. She's a wonderful cook. And we've had discussions. We've had discussions about, she and I, about what is her greater influence on her cooking. Her Jewish background or Iraqi, and she said Iraqi. And so that visits the book because the main protagonist in the book, a lawyer for the family, her name is Shifra. Shifra is an American Israeli Jew of Iraqi and Moroccan descent. And she cooks. And there's in particular a scene in the book where these visiting Palestinian students come over for dinner at Passover. And she fixes makluba, which is a very traditional Iraqi dish. And that's part of the inspiration. There is a character who is, I alluded to him before, a lawyer about 65 years old in the book, who's representing the family. And much of his
What's the character's name in the book?
His name is Michael Levine. And Michael Levine, his experience as a lawyer, how he views the law and strategy, that's invested, that's much of me. There are elements of the other characters who are vested with the worst parts of me. Shifra is notorious for having a terrible temper. She got that from me.
Well, my wife has, that has to be from you.
And then there's a character, Tony Silvestri, who is not really a central and pivotal character to the book, but he is Michael Levine's mentor, older partner.
And he's not Jewish, is he?
He's not Jewish. He's Italian in the book, but he is actually completely drawn from a very dear and old friend of mine, Terry Singleton, who is he's one of the finest lawyers I've ever known, and he's been a great friend for well over 30 years. And so those character parts were pretty easy to put together. And then there's a member of the family of she's the sister of the student who was killed. And the sister's name is Irasema. That's my wife's middle name. And much of her character is drawn from my wife. And so those parts were easy to do. Some of the other characters, it took a lot more thought to put them together.
We're really getting an insight in how an author creates his work of art.
Well, let's not get too carried away. This author, I don't know about good authors.
This author. Well, you used the term edutainment at the very beginning of this interview. And how does Caught in the Campus Crossfire do that?
Just weaving the whole history that we've gone into and explaining the law of civil rights and how we are all entitled to protection. And the idea is for the book to serve not only as education, but also as somewhat of a blueprint for students and their families to follow in dealing with administrations who are not responding appropriately to campus anti-Semitism. And in fact, some of the law that's discussed that I've alluded to, it's on the book website at campuscrossfire.com. And to that end, there is a letter by a student in the book to the administration talking about the rights that Jewish students have to be protected. And that letter is a tremendous template for students to follow. And I've included that letter on the book website. So it's a very useful resource, the book and the website.
Well, Mitch, I just want to tell you how much I appreciate all of your insights. I think the book is fantastic. I was pleasantly surprised when all of a sudden you called me and you said, "Hey, Mike, I've written this book," because I've known you as for a very long time, since law school, and you are meticulous and you are somewhat of a perfectionist. And when I read the book, all of those qualities came out. It's really an excellent book. I highly recommend the book, Caught in the Campus Crossfire, to everyone. I suggest you visit his website, and I highly suggest that you buy the book and tell your friends. Thank you again, Mitch. Appreciate it.
Thank you.